Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Beyond Inclusion, Meet the BIPOC Press. I'm Don Guttenplan. I'm the editor of The Nation and not a member of the BIPOC Press, but I'm delighted to introduce you to our distinguished panel today, starting with an old friend of The Nation, Laura Flanders. Laura is the host and executive producer of the Laura Flanders Show, a forward-looking public affairs program carried on close to 300 PBS stations and on community radio, as well as streaming on YouTube and a podcast. Laura is a contributing writer to The Nation and also the author of 6 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species, and Blue Grit, True Democrats Take Back Politics from the Politicians. The Nation members of this audience will know Laura both from Air America Radio, from Your Call, which she was the founding host of on KALW Public Radio, and also Counterspin, the radio program from the Media Watch group FAIR. And I also should say that it is both nervous making and an honor to be moderating a program with Laura, who moderates so many events for The Nation and is the most brilliant moderator I know. So I'm going to try and at least fill a little bit of her shoes here. And then we've got Mitra Kalita. Mitra is a veteran journalist, media executive, prolific commentator, and the author of 2 books. And recently she launched Epicenter NYC, a newsletter to help New Yorkers get through the pandemic. And the reason Mitra is here today, aside from all those achievements, is because she and the next person I'm going to introduce are co-founders of URL Media, a network of Black and Brown-owned media organizations created to uplift, respect, and love the communities we serve, that's they serve, but also we serve, and that share content distribution and revenues to increase their long-term sustainability. Mitra is on the board of the Philadelphia Inquirer and writes a weekly column for Time magazine. And she was also most recently SVP at CNN Digital, overseeing the national news, breaking news, programming, opinion, and features teams. And her co-founder of URL Media is Sara Lomax-Reese, who's also president and CEO of WURD Radio, Pennsylvania's only African-American owned talk radio station. Sara transformed WURD Radio from a legacy talk radio station to a multimedia communications company, providing cutting-edge original programming on air, online, through video and community events. In 2017, Sara led the expansion of the AM WURD to the FM dial, where it now simulcasts both on 900 AM and 96.1 FM, and also spearheaded the launch of an environmental justice journalism platform called EcoWURD or EcoWord.com. But for those of you who are looking for it on the web, it's ECOWURD.com. And in 2019, she launched a new initiative called Livelihood, focused on jobs, career readiness, and entrepreneurship to address the persistent wealth gap in the Black community, as well as co-founding URL Media. And she's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and has written for the Miami Herald, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Essence magazine. Here's a small but to me interesting personal note. She's also an avid yoga and meditation practitioner. So hopefully we won't need the meditation today, but if you're wondering where her wonderful posture comes from, perhaps it's the yoga. I don't know. And then from the Nation side, I have the pleasure of presenting Lizzy Ratner, who's a senior editor at The Nation and somebody who's been at The Nation longer than I have. So a distinguished colleague, and then I'm the editor of The Nation. So with that, we're going to get the conversation underway, and I'm going to let Lizzy ask the first couple of questions, and then I'll jump in.
Thank you so much, Don, and thanks to all our wonderful panelists. A quick note to just say that I'm incredibly excited to be here today and incredibly happy. I spend my days wading through the muck of really terrible news. terrible news in terms of what other humans are doing to other humans, but also terrible media news, stories of beloved independent institutions going belly up. Yesterday it was Bitch Media. We've got layoffs left, right, and center, BuzzFeed News, one place after another. But today we're going to be talking to media makers who are actually engaged in not only creating excellent media, but in amplifying each other's voices, making the independent media more robust, not by trying to outcompete each other, but by collaborating, by getting together in partnership to try to create a platform that is big enough for everybody, not just big enough for everybody, but that is even more expansive. So it's really an honor to be here with the three of you. I'm going to now hop into my first question. I'd love to start by focusing on URL Media, this incredibly exciting, relatively new collaboration. So can you start telling us, Sara and Mitra, I'd love to hear really about your history and mission, your growth and your goals. How did URL come about? What have you done in the last year or so? Where are you going? And what does it really mean to be in partnership?
Sara, you want to start?
I was going to say, Mitra, see, I had my mic on mute. You got me. Let's say, Mitra, you want to start? I'll start. Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, thank you both. And thanks to the nation for inviting us to have this conversation. URL stands for Uplift, Respect, and Love. And it is, as you described, a network of high-performing Black and Brown owned media organizations that have come together to share content, share revenues, and to really expand our reach and our amplification of the work that we're doing. Mitra and I met in 2018 initially at a conference, and then we were in a program at Harvard, the Media Transformation Challenge program, which was a group of media people from all over the world. It was like a professional development, performance-driven change program. And so we met and really got to know each other through that one-year program at Harvard, and got to see each other in action, because it was she was at CNN at the time. I was still doing my work that I'm still doing at WURD in Philadelphia. And so we really got to know each other there. And in 2020, when the racial justice protests really got into full swing after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and the names keep going and going. But the protests, Mitra called me and she was like, whoa, this is a moment that requires a response. And I think that you and I have something, that we could uniquely do together. And so we started batting around ideas, and very quickly we arrived at the assumption that we did not want to create another digital startup. There were a lot of media organizations that have been in existence, like Word. We're almost 20 years old. There are a lot of independent Black and Brown owned media organizations that have been doing the work for years and years, that we wanted to say, what if we put together a network that really addressed the pain points that independent Black and Brown media experience, from underfunding, being under-resourced, not having massive reach, all of those things. What if we were able to come together and create this network to address those pain points and, be stronger basically together? And so that's really the origin story of URL. And Mitra, I'll let you kind of fill in. Yeah.
So Sara was absolutely accurate in that rendering. I will say, selfishly, when I called her, I had already launched Epicenter. So I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, which is a very hard-hit community in the pandemic. I was still working at CNN, and I had to get special permission to launch a newsletter to help my community. It was a really organic startup. It was not kind of my exit strategy from CNN, I promise. And what I discovered in that process of trying to serve this community here in Queens, Jackson Heights, Corona, and Elmhurst were the three neighborhoods that were really, really hard hit. And at the same time, I was at CNN, which was the biggest of the big. And we were beloved when we launched ways to surface needs in the community, whether it was, where you could get a COVID test, what's the line at Patel Brothers like, where can you get yeast? I mean, kind of the basics of getting through that initial part of the pandemic. But also, we were tiny, and it felt like we were always going to be tiny on an internet that's so rooted in scale, right? You have to be a CNN to have search terms trend. You have to be a CNN to game the algorithms on Facebook. And in many ways, what I had learned from Sara in the time that, I was at CNN and she was at Word, and we were getting to know each other in this program, was how much she centers the Black community in Philadelphia in her work. And that there is such a clear identification of these are the people we're serving. And it's the opposite of a CNN, which is kind of the biggest of the big, and we're trying to serve everybody. And in getting to know Sara, I couldn't help but look in the mirror and say, in trying to serve everybody, am I actually serving nobody? And so when we get to this point of me being immersed in COVID, my neighborhood, CNN for a few months, and then we have the protests after the death of George Floyd, I felt like what I was doing as a media executive was untenable just for my life and this desire to carve out another path. And I think what we'll talk a lot about today is this idea of collaboration, how working with other newsrooms can make you feel so much bigger than you really are, but actually starts to center communities and the solve and the service for the issues we're facing, versus the way mainstream media works is you're kind of reacting or waiting for something to trend, and you present problems, but actually you're not really a part of the solve or the service.
I thank you so much for both of those answers. I would love to bring Laura now into the conversation and get her thoughts on just that topic, collaboration. So Laura, can you tell me sort of how you come into this discussion, how Meet the BIPOC Press started on your show, and kind of most specifically, how the collaboration fits within your show's mission to be, quote, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it.
Well, thank you, Lizzie. Just think of it, Meet the Press. It's the longest running show on television, dating back to the 1940s. And what was it? The model was and has been for decades, one guy, originally it was a woman, but she's forgotten, one white guy interviewing a power broker. Now, all the presidents have appeared on Meet the Press, and that model of the important interview of the week was exactly the model that we wanted to blow up on this program. The idea that there is one version of truth, that there is one epitome of power, that there is one show that everybody should watch to get their talking points for the week. And the fact that the Laura Flanders Show secured a spot on public television stations that just happens to be after the end of Meet the Press every Sunday morning, I thought, well, here's a great opportunity to present a very different picture of our media. And specifically, I think last year, it seemed critically important to me that we get a picture of the vibrancy of Black and Brown media, which has always been around in this country. There are new startups like Mitra's, but the history of Black and Brown and Indigenous and immigrant media goes back to the very first years before the revolution. So, I thought always that the mission of my work has been to destabilize the very stable, usually very polar options that we're given as our media diet. You can have this one or that one, but probably there are only two. Our political diet, you can have this one or that one, and they're usually barely distinguishable. Our cable diet, well, we only get one of those in most places that we live. But to destabilize and blow into people's living rooms a much bigger picture of possibility for power, for journalism, for politics, for economics. That's what we do on the Laura Flanders Show. And that's what we mean by the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. Our goal is to show a whole lot of people doing things that you have been told are impossible and surviving as independent Black and Brown owned small scales, community serving, local media has been something we've been told is impossible. But right when we were launching our second season on public television and about to be weekly every week right after Meet the Press, I reached out to Sara, whom I knew from some other misbegotten attempt to work with media in a positive direction. And I said, we want to do a media roundtable. Would you be on it? And she said, well, I've actually just started this whole network of people who would like to be on it. And that's where the idea was born. So we're excited to be doing it once a month on the Laura Flanders Show. All month long, we bring people programming about, messages of possibility and people making change where they live. And once a month, we take a look at how the BIPOC media has been covering that same month. And it's been, wow, it's been illuminating for me. It's been truly an honor to work with Sara and Mitra. I'm always learning things. And I think our audience is getting a message that there's more than one kind of press.
Thanks, Laura. That's great. I have to say that one of the questioners in the chat asked if we could name Martha Roundtree, who's the person who originated Meet the Press.
Exactly.
I have to tell you, when I was writing my I.F. Stone biography, I interviewed Martha Roundtree, and she was at that point in her late 80s and was sharp as a tack and hadn't forgiven anybody.
That's the spirit.
Which was great to hear. I have a couple of things I'd like to start off with, and one is a question of funding. And I guess here's two questions, and you can address either or both at the same time. One is funding, and one is a question of ideological, the lane you find yourselves in. Because what interested me about the old Meet the Press is that it used to be wide open ideologically, and then after the Cold War, it shut down into a very narrow vision of possible discussion, which was also part of what got Martha Roundtree forced out. So I'm curious about that, about whether you feel that there are boundaries about what you can talk about, particularly in the BIPOC press, the BIPOC media. And then I was talking to a friend who was at BuzzFeed and was talking about the early years of BuzzFeed when, as she described it, money was pouring in through the windows. And I'm guessing that Sara and Mitra, that's not an experience either of y'all have had. So I'm interested in this intersection of ideological policing or rigidity and how you stay alive in terms of your own organizations and this collaboration. And Sara, maybe you'd like to start this time, and then we'll go to Mitra.
Sure. So, there's nothing really off limits in terms of what we cover. And, in general, in terms of URL, I mean, we are a network right now of 11 independently owned media organizations that are owned by Black and Brown people. So there's 11 organizations that are a part of the URL network. WURD, my radio station, and Epicenter are two of those 11. And I know, so URL does not mandate any kind of ideological framework from any of our partners. They are in the network because they represent authentic engagement and trusted interaction with their audiences. They represent quality content. And so, from an ideological standpoint, I know for me at WURD, as Mitra referenced before, it's all about our audience. Like, how can we be of service to our audience? What does our audience need? And so, we are about speaking truth to power. And in a city like Philadelphia, that is almost 45% Black/African-American, we have a responsibility to be a place where the Black community can speak and be heard. We can wrestle with the hard issues. We can talk about the complicated ones, all of that. But there's really nothing that's off limits. What that means from an economic standpoint, it's hard. It's hard as hell to make authentic, community-based media profitable or, sustainable. And that is where, creativity, tenacity, relationships, all of those things, everything that you have comes into play. And why URL was launched was, we really believe that Black and Brown media, if we come together, have the potential of being leaders, and not always being kind of starved for resources and starved for talent and all of those things. If we can create this bigger platform, we can become the organizations of choice where people want to and see their futures growing and being able to go up the ladder in a media organization where a lot of Black and Brown people, there is really I don't know if it's a glass ceiling or a concrete ceiling, whatever. It's very difficult to get to the top levels in mainstream media organizations for BIPOC folks. So we are looking at ways to create additional revenue opportunities for Black and Brown organizations through URL, but it is complicated. All of the momentum that was articulated after the 2020 protests in terms of support for BIPOC organizations and institutions seems to be dwindling a little bit, or some of the air is coming out of that sail. But it doesn't matter. We're here to do the work no matter what, because the audiences need our voices, our work, and that's who we're serving.
Mitra?
I would just say that there's a question mark that I feel comfortable about 1.5 years into this journey saying those 2020 commitments were questionable to begin with. As we're looking at some of where have you all really put your money? And I'm talking about advertisers, funders, investors. Sara and I, before we launched in January of 2021, days after President Biden was inaugurated, intentionally, because we said we don't want the next 4 years to look like the last 4 or the last 400, right? We really intentionally, as the country was hitting reset, we felt like there should be a reset on the media. That was very intentional. But before that, Sara and I shopped the idea around to investors. And, I didn't say it in the moment, but I vowed last night when I saw the news about Bitch Media, which I'm glad Lizzie referenced, I said, we really need to get a lot more honest about just how hard this is. And so when Sara and I went out there, we met with investors, and in typical kind of Silicon Valley positioning, they start poking holes into your idea, right? And we're coming on the heels of a movement that is vowing to change everything. And yet, if you're going to evaluate me by the same standards of how you've evaluated every business idea or media models, which, by the way, show me a successful one in what you're describing, I think that's really unfair. And so in the time, I didn't shout about that. Now I'm sort of angry enough that, and we've actually talked about this on Laura's show, in terms of the corporate commitments and where are they really? So I'm glad to have that platform, but I think that's something that, I think all of us can underscore and get honest about. Now I will pivot to what that forced, because Sara and I are scrappy and true believers, is that our media model from day one has been a diversified one. So we have advertising, we have some philanthropy, and we do have a thriving, growing B2B arm of diversity, equity, and inclusion in recruitment, coaching, and just DEI work that has not just sustained our business, but allowed us to thrive. And I share that because it was out of necessity from those early conversations where there were a few naysayers, and you get to the stage where you're like, I could bang my head against the wall convincing you this is a good idea, or we could just go out and show you that this is a really good idea. And that's what we decided to do.
Interesting. Well, I want to come back, and I suspect we will, to this difference between talking the talk and walking the walk, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, when we saw lots of big corporations, talking the talk. So it'd be interesting to talk more about your experience of that. But first, I want to, Laura, what's it been, 3 years you've been on PBS?
Yes, and we should say, I'm a big believer in, jump and the net will materialize. It hasn't always worked out. but our program airs on public television. Those are public airwaves, as we all remember.
So
But
I have a question I want to just stop and say,
Oh, go ahead.
how did you persuade them to let you do that?
Okay, well, that's a second question. But on the money question, I think it's important for people to realize, public television hasn't really been invested in since the 1960s. Instead, its appropriations have been cut back and back and back and back and made more and more political. So as a network of stations, it's as dependent on corporate underwriting almost as the commercial networks, not quite. There's still pledge drives, but that money that you pledge to your local station does not support the majority of programming. Now, I believe in pledging. We're never going to get public television again in our lifetimes, so let's keep what we have. But the majority of what you see on public television stations, whether it's Channel 13 or LIW or HYY in Philadelphia, the majority of the material that you see is produced by independent producers like me. We raise the money from foundations and from our audience. And that is, as Mitra said, really, really hard. And I think that in independent media world, many of us have been to workshops that say, you must invest in your back room, as it were, the back office, as much as you invest in the journalism, and we just can't do it. I can't do it. I invest in the journalism, and therefore I am constantly trying to play catch up with not having enough infrastructure to get us to the next level financially. Now, that may be more than you will want to hear, but it is a constant struggle, just as Mitra said. But I believe absolutely that if we don't provide the US public, particularly the public television watching public, which I think we can say is a fairly good representation of the country as a whole. We're on in every state except for South Dakota. We're on at a prime time for public affairs. What we know of the audience is that it's pretty 50-50 men and women. And there's a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats watching who want some positive solutions. If we're not giving people some message of how we as a society can move forward collaboratively in a positive direction, the only message we're going to be getting from any other place is a message of fight for your own, keep your piece of the pie, and keep anybody else from getting it. That zero-sum game mentality that you see on every single other network, whether it's Democratic leaning or Republican. So I feel like it's my mission to do this work and to create space in the media for the reporting that is being ignored elsewhere, and the funding. Ojalá, please subscribe to the Laura Flanders Show. You can do it at lauraflanders.org, and I'm sure we'll hear the same pitch from everybody. This stuff is difficult, but you know what? Journalism has always been difficult. People have never gotten rich off journalism. We cobbled together a model where we sold cars and had singles ads, in the back of the paper, but that was never an ideal way of funding our information system. So we're in a period of transformation. What else is new? We'll keep doing it as long as we possibly can.
Well, I'm going to still come back to the second question, which is, we think of public television, those of us who watch it, as a great resource, but also as a gatekeeper. Mm-hmm. And for others who might want to crash through those gates, how did you do it?
Well, I'll tell you, the only thing we've at the moment run up against in terms of censorship at American Public Television, which is the independent syndicator that we pay to get the show out, is that they don't like signs of cleavage. You have to blur any cleavage that appears. And they don't like vaginas, no image of a vagina on a signpost. Evans Levy, good on you. But the word is still no in public television. And it is very difficult to cover campaigns. We recently had Greg Kazar, the wonderful progressive Democrat who just won in a Texas district that goes from Austin to San Antonio. Amazing guy on the show. And APT complained that we played some of his campaign video. So they're very touchy about anything that seems partisan, but so far so good. The actual content of our show is being gobbled up. I'm telling you, from coast to coast in every state, people are finding positive feedback for putting our show on the air. In New York, we're on 5 different stations, and several stations play us more than once a week, not because they don't have anything else to put on, but apparently their audience appreciate what we're doing. And that includes our monthly Meet the BIPOC media roundtables.
Great, thank you. Mitra, sorry.
Go ahead, Don.
One more, and then I'm gonna turn back to you, Lizzie. But
it's all good.
I'd like to hear from Mitra first and then from Sara about what you've learned from the other members of the URL media, what you've learned from your collaboration, and what, if anything, has surprised you. And maybe Mitra, you go first this time.
Sure. I mean, I learn from them every single day. I think one of the best parts of URL is that we have this built-in kind of best practices, and it's Sara outlined, we stand for uplift, respect, and love. And it's actually like a really meta approach to running a business and running a collaboration. It's not just something we're paying lip service to. It manifests in different, I mean, I spent 20 plus years in mainstream media. And so this is the first job where there's such, I mean, just as an example, like if I do a pitch to an advertiser and someone wants to see it, I have no qualms sharing the deck that I've given the advertiser. And that might sound like a really minor example, but when you're a tiny media company, being able to look at other people's decks and how they're framing pitches and, you know, how am I going to Laura's kind of talking about the back office and the investment, having access to how other people do that teaches me so much every day as I'm trying to grow both Epicenter and URL media. I think the other piece is, what are the issues that we are looking at differently? And that's kind of before we do our monthly roundtable with Laura, we'll often brainstorm, you know, these are some issues that are coming up a lot. And just for perspective, you know, yesterday we had the subway shooting in Brooklyn in New York City. And immediately when I saw that NYPD put out, we're looking for a Black suspect, I texted some of the other New York-based members and I said, hey guys, for like a few years now, we really haven't been seeing race in the suspect in the same, like, is this new that NYPD is doing this? Like, should I feel a certain way? And just immediately the ability to talk about that among our own versus the lens of mainstream media is everything for me, because it allows me to say, this is how we should cover the story without all the noise of Twitter saying this, CNN is saying this, you know, and I think being grounded in your community in terms of what you're trying to say, but having other journalists that you have the ability to, I mean, just frankly, in that moment, I was like, am I the only one who thinks this is weird? And you don't think you're so alone in some of these smaller organizations.
Thanks. Sara, WURD is both a kind of legacy property and something that you've changed. And I wonder if in this collaboration with URL, that makes you both a mentor and a, you know, and a mentee, and how that's been for you.
Yeah, we're an OG. Yeah, it's great. I mean, the thing that went, I was just thinking about your previous question. The thing that is really powerful and that I learned from at WURD is both kind of a legacy and a an established entity, because URL, like I said, there's 11 members, and we have startups and young organizations like Mitra's, like Epicenter, and we have older and longer standing media properties like the Haitian Times. But the thing that's so interesting to me and that I learned from a lot is the fact that we do represent so many different platforms. So we've got Documented that's working on WhatsApp. We've got, Sahan Journal that's digital and newsletter, and Epicenter, but all of them are rooted in community and rooted in kind of a trusted, ongoing, authentic relationship with their audiences, which is kind of what WURD is all about. And I love the cross-fertilization. So for instance, Sahan Journal is in Minneapolis. And so when the Derek Chauvin trial was happening, Word was able to bring on some of the Sahan Journal reporters to talk about what is it like on the ground in Minneapolis in this moment for, both African immigrants and Black Americans in that community. And so we're able to kind of draw from the expertise. We've done things with Palabra around Afro-Latinos. Scalawag is covering the South. So they did an amazing article with Samaria Rice, who is Tamir Rice's mother. And so just having access to content and the reporting done specifically for a localized audience, but there are through lines that we're able to create within the network. And because we're radio, we're able to draw on them in ways that, and have interviews with folks in ways that we might not have access to that on the ground reporting if we weren't a part of URL.
Thank you. Lizzie, before we go to audience questions, you had one, so I didn't mean to step on your question. And then we'll
No,
go
that's
to
totally
Kalita.
fine. I was just getting excited and wanted to jump in. I have a question which is a potentially big one. So I'm going to throw it out there. And, you know, all of you are welcome to respond, but certainly don't have to respond because I know we do have questions beginning to bubble up from the audience. But I think, Mitra, you mentioned kind of the difference between mainstream media and sort of the BIPOC media or the sort of community-driven media that you're engaged with. And so the one question that sort of haunts me, but also I'm really curious about, what are the differences and similarities, overlap or non-overlap, between what like we at the Nation would call the progressive media or independent media and BIPOC media? On the one hand, you know, one naive part of me is like, isn't that the same? But I also recognize sort of the challenges or sort of the complexity, to put it kindly, of the background of the media in which I work, sort of Nation progressive media. So I would love to hear any or all of you just reflect on similarities, differences, tensions, you know, failures, frankly, if you're game for that.
So I'm actually thinking of a real live one, Sarah. I don't know if you saw, but they made an arrest in the suspect I just mentioned, and he's from Philadelphia. And so now I'm like, well, epicenter.
He's from Philly?
I think so. He had an address in Philly. But the point being, to talk about what I just said, I would feel way more comfortable having that conversation about the race of a suspect and increased crime on the subway and how Asian women in New York City are feeling right now in a setting where it's Sarah's radio station and my staff or my audience, or it's community and community, because I feel like that conversation anywhere else starts to feel like we're divided, and we're also coming at it from kind of tropes of Black Asian relations, or yeah, and we Sarah and I've had this conversation so many times that you can't not acknowledge that there's a history among communities, but I don't want that to be defined by whiteness. I would like us to talk about that in a very real way. And so that's just one example that's right before us. And I don't know if I'm doing justice with that particular example, except that there are a lot of intra-racial relationships that I feel are more honest in certain settings. The other thing I'll just say, and I'd love Laura and Sarah's thoughts on this, but you know, when I think about things from a progressive lens, I still think about it from the traditional political spectrum. And when I try to cover politics from the URL perspective as well as Epicenter's perspective, I really try to say, what is it that we're trying to help our community understand? How can we advocate for our community? Is there a way to not do this on the one hand, on the other hand, in covering policy, but really get to what this means for people? And actually, we talked about lessons learned from the partners. That's one area that, you know, I draw a lot of inspiration from how, just, you know, as another example, one of our partners is a Bangladeshi live streaming channel. When it interviews candidates for New York City Council or State Assembly in Albany, they'll ask questions about Uber from the perspective of drivers. They're not asking from Uber like policy that, you know, I read about in the Times or the Wall Street Journal. They're asking literally from the perspective of drivers. And so I think one thing we just need to acknowledge is that even within the political spectrum, as we've kind of laid out, the mainstream press does not capture the nuanced multitude of perspectives within our communities.
Sarah, do you want to jump in on that? Or should I tee up another?
I want to jump in on that. Am I
Go ahead,
allowed?
Lauren.
I would just say, you know, Lizzie, I mean, I'm about as old school progressive media, or at least as ensconced in that world as you can imagine. I started writing for The Nation, I think, in my 20s. And I've never really, apart from being a sort of tolerated guest in commercial media, had a spot in that forum, except for Air America. And I don't know whether you call that mainstream or not. It was certainly commercial. And yet, and this collaboration with URL Media has been a real learning experience for me, and has been an exercise, and a quite sometimes difficult, I think, exercise in practicing how do we work this out in public? How do we think in public together? Which is what we do every week on the show. And we've had all sorts of experiments with me just kind of throwing to Sara and Mitra to go with the show. I'll come back at the end. And then I thought, well, that didn't seem too good. I was there at the beginning and there at the end. And what happens to me in the middle? Am I supposed to be listening? Am I not listening? Very weird. Then we've had all three of us trying to be hosts together, which is also quite difficult. We're trying to work it out. And one of the exciting things about having this space in public television, which, to answer Carolyn's question, yes, we pay for. We are not paid to do it. We pay for it. But one of the things about having this space without commercials, where we can actually see a conversation develop, is that we are working it out, and that we are. You can see it happen in lifetime, when sort of I'm gaily going off on some theme and Sara and Mitra are like, huh? Doesn't resonate at all. Or Sara says something that is totally takes me aback. Like I remember a great moment where I think I'm doing great by quoting Flo Kennedy, where she says, what would you rather see come through the door, one lion or 100 mice? And Sara says, I want to see 100 lions. It's like, yes, good update. I think that that's what media at its best, plural noun, this is not an article, it's live, kind of live interaction. It's what we can model, I think. And we're sort of modeling not being perfect at it, but at least agreeing to sit with each other and listen. And as they say these days, as Loretta Ross has taught us, to call one another in, not call one another out, and to try to call in the audience to believing that they too can engage in these kinds of conversations. Which, just say one last thing, one of the things that's exciting to me when you talk about Sahan Journal or Haitian Times or Scalawag is these are all local media, but through our television broadcast, our distribution, we can bring those local stories to the state where they originate and to the country. So we're doing a kind of trans-local reporting, local to local, bringing out to the national. And that has also been an exciting part of this. It's an experiment, did we mention? We're going to go into our second year, and we'll tell you more about it next time. This time next year. How about that?
Great. Well, in terms of not being perfect, that definitely resonates with me. I mean, the nation has been trying to get better and trying to do it better for a very long time. Sometimes it feels like we're just banging our head against the wall. Sometimes it feels we make some progress. We have a great question that is, in a way, flows out of that from, and I apologize if I'm not saying your last name correctly, Sahi Gakina, about how the issues or the rhetoric or the reportage on URL differ from the mainstream media. And Sara, I hope you'd take that one first.
Sure, and I'll kind of tie in what I was going to say to Liz's question too. I think that one of the big things, differentiators is, I really believe, and it's a little bit what Mitra was speaking to, context matters. Like there are things that we can say on WURD, which is a Black-owned, Black-focused, Black audience media outlet, that if it was said on CNN or even on the Laura Flanders Show, it might be received very differently. And so I think that the fact that our URL media organizations have this very direct relationship with their audiences, they are reporting from being embedded. And so it's not this kind of swoop in and, I don't know, there's a lot of times I'm asked this question, is what you do advocacy or journalism? And that's really, to me, that is not a real question because what we're about is being of service and being of value to our audiences. And so, you know, but and part of that value comes from being in the community and not having this objective lens that you're just you know, kind of reporting out from above, from on high, but you're actually embedded. And so I think that that's a differentiator. I do really feel like we're seeing a lot of partnerships in the journalism space right now. And as having done this work for a long time, I've been in a lot of partnerships with quote unquote mainstream media in Philadelphia. And a lot of times they are very lopsided. They're, you know, you are kind of like the little parsley garnish on the side, and, you know, the big media organization is the, you know, is the steak, for lack of a better metaphor. And the thing that I really value about our partnership with the Laura Flanders Show is it's not like that. You know, it really is, we are coming to this partnership as equals and as entities that are experimenting, exploring, but we're bringing something that's new and valued. And I really just have to give a shout out to Laura's team for having that kind of framework where we've never felt like, you know, we are just kind of the token, you know, DEI kind of, you know, representation, but this is an authentic partnership. And I think that that's really important for mainstream or big media to look inwardly and figure out, how do we, if we are going to do this work, how are we going to do it in a way that's actually authentic and fair and equitable and really values everybody equally.
I'd like to hear from, thank you, Sarah. That just prompted all sorts of, set off all sorts of fireworks in my head. We have a question from Lisa H about what are some steps newsrooms or networks can take to invite more unrepresented communities into the conversation. And then we have another conversation about, question about lifting up voices and whether we need ladders and hierarchies inside the media. That's from Joseph Clark. And I guess I'm hoping that Laura and Mitra might say something about, well, how you know it's an equal partnership as opposed to an unequal partnership. And Laura, how you keep, you know, how you structure this, how you came to this as it were the inviting or the convening partner, you know, in a way that signaled that you were actually inviting people in as equals. So maybe Laura and then Mitra.
But just quickly, I think relationships matter, and relationships like the ones that Mitra and Sarah had with each other before they decided to found URL Media, relationships that each of the members of URL Media have with their audience, with their community, the people that they are embedded with. And then, you know, Sarah and I actually had a chance to know each other at least a little before this. I think what's so problematic is how big corporations go through some sort of EDI training and then decide, oh, quick, let's find some people to, you know, promote into positions that they haven't prepared, without any real sense of what they're doing or why they're doing it, or just trying to sort of do bean counting. I did this because I want the stories that the URL reporters bring to me and my audience are stories that otherwise we wouldn't hear. This is great reporting. We're not doing anybody any favors here. Instead, I think that we're benefiting from the, you know, the riches of what the URL journalists and their sources and their communities are providing. So, you know, in our house, we are very happy to have Sarah and Mitra at the table, and it's an equal table. Absolutely.
Mitra?
I think one mistake we make is in the term giving space, which has white people just staying silent. And what I value about Laura and the show, and actually even on some issues, Sarah will, not that she calls me out, but I'll say, well, do we want to have this framed from our Black members or a Black expert, right? I'm pretty upfront about that if it's something within the Black community. And she'll say to me, I don't want only Black people to be talking about this. And so that has changed me, but I also feel like we are showing our way to be able to give space, but not be silent. And I think that's, when we talk about what could mainstream media do differently, I would look at some of those shows as examples of, we're literally working our way through it. Sometimes Laura will be like, Mitra and Sara, you disagree on the role of white people in the election last time. We'll go into it. And I come from, I'm the daughter of immigrants. I was raised in Puerto Rico. Like, my perspectives are different from an African-American history that's centuries old here. And that's a part of our experience. So I think in mainstream media, we kind of gloss over how complicated it is. And I say this all the time, like when I would interview people like about the weather and they'd say, oh, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, I'd be like, oh gosh, I'm not going to write that part. I'll just say, oh, he said it's so hot and he was sweating. And, we don't lean into the complicated parts of people and identity. And this has been, if again, like watch some of the shows, it's an exercise in leaning into the complicated parts of identity. And then just the last thing I would say on the ladders and hierarchies, this is something, as we're building a company, one of the greatest gifts of building a company in 2021 through 2022, and hopefully for many years going forward, is learning how not to do things. And we happen to be in a moment where, everything we thought about the labor market and how people want to work and why they work is just in upheaval. And so I do feel like, and we've talked about this on Laura's show too, what it means to be a company that centers Blackness is something we try to exercise in who we're picking as our vendors, who we're hiring, how we talk about things. And that's a conversation I don't know that a startup would have had, a few years ago. I don't know how many startups are having that conversation right now, quite frankly.
We have a nuts and bolts question from John, who asks, sharing content sounds straightforward, but how does the URL network go about sharing revenues?
Oh, John.
Now, maybe one of you all planted that. I don't know, but
no.
I planted that for Sara to take.
Yeah. All I can say is it's hard as hell, and we're figuring it out. But like a fundamental. So year one was all about getting up and running, getting out there, just assembling the network, the initial network, and all of that stuff. Year two is really about operationalizing all of it. And, the advertising and sponsorship and revenue model is unfolding. It's evolving and developing. And so we are figuring out the economics of how we make everyone who is a part of the network whole economically and make URL whole economically with, these different revenue streams and opportunities. But it is complicated. It's complicated on many different levels. It's more complicated than I think we thought it would be when we came up with this idea. But the fundamental goal is absolutely the same from when we started to right now, which is we know that one of the reasons that Black and brown media organizations have always struggled is from a lack of money, a lack of a financial wherewithal. And so we are committed to figuring out how those, what all of the ways that we can share revenues so that we can solve for one of those fundamental issues that keep us on our heels and on fumes. And so, the advertising model is basically we whack it up based on share of audience. If an advertiser wants to reach the AAPI audience, we look at what is our, what is the partner or the native or the Black audience. Then we look at how we disseminate or distribute revenues to those partners that reach those audiences, as well as figuring out how we translate revenues across the entire network, because we know that we want all of the partners to benefit from being in this network monetarily, as well as from a reach and audience growth standpoint. I don't know, that the short answer is we're testing and learning, and we're figuring it out, and are very committed to figuring it out.
Great, thanks.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Thank you so much for that answer, Sarah. I have a quick question, well, a very big question, but then I'm going to ask you guys to respond to quickly. That sort of flows from what you were saying, Sarah. And it is this: Emma Stack asks, are there any legislative possibilities for helping support and sustain independent media? What elected politicians understand the issue? So it would be wonderful if maybe one of you could take that, and then we should probably flow toward closing things up. And maybe you can all offer some thoughts on what you're most excited about going forward with the collaboration, what we can expect to see perhaps on the next Meet the BIPOC Media Roundtable. So anyway, take it away.
Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can rattle off some government initiatives, and then I'll leave it to the two of you to be way more eloquent as we close out. Government possibilities are actually, there's a few before us. One is tax credits for hiring journalists in local news organizations. There's a $25,000 tax credit that's been proposed for organizations like mine. It would actually be pretty revolutionary for some of our BIPOC members that rely on freelance and contract work, not so much. So you really need to make sure you're not excluding some media models in these efforts. New York City, actually New York State has enacted legislation where you have to, if you're an agency in New York, you have to advertise with community media. That's been a game changer for many of our members. I just had dinner with the editor of the Haitian Times last night. It's a significant part of their revenue. One challenge there that I'm not putting on him, but I could say, having done business with the city, whether they pay you on time or not is something we never talk about as local organizations, and that's very much an issue. And then the third, I would say what Laura said is there hasn't been significant investment in public media in quite some time. I don't think the political climate for it has been ripe for the last few years, but that just feels like the elephant in the room as we're kind of skirting around that issue.
This
Laura,
proposal that the proposal that Dean Baker made many years ago is still out there and still getting a certain amount of traction. His idea was that you would have a checkoff on your taxes that you could dedicate to the nonprofit media. In this case, it was all nonprofit media of your choice. That's something that is still being kind of bandied about out there. And I will say that, you know, on the more quiet side, and perhaps because confirmations have proven a little tricky in this administration, Gigi Sohn, a longtime advocate of diversity in media, of, you know, non breaking up the media trusts, is the nominee, as far as I understand it, to head up the FCC at this point. Now, I may be out of date and she's withdrawn her nomination, but there are some good sort of trust-busting media, public media-minded people in the administration. And it's important that we keep track of what's happening there, because in all this talk about a new deal for everything, a new deal with all the problems of the New Deal, the New Deal was the era in which we got public broadcasting as a concept, and now is absolutely the time to reinvest. And as I've argued, federal legislation has done so much bad to local media by you know, opening up the floodgates to monopoly ownership and facilitating monopoly at every level, that to invest in a reparations kind of way into community media that is serving the communities that have been most hit and have benefited the least from that monopoly process would be totally appropriate. So you can check out our wonderful friends at FAIR, the Media Watch Group, fair.org, or Free Press to find out more.
Sarah, anybody you want to shout out before we close it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association, MMCA, that's doing a lot of work in Washington around new ways of funding BIPOC media organizations through legislation and tax credits and things like that. So I'm keeping an eye on that. I'm also a big fan of Media 2070, which is about the reparations, media reparations for, that has to happen in order to make good from mainstream media on all of the ways that they were complicit in promoting and extending slavery and Jim Crow and all of the anti-Black racist things that mainstream media contributed to. So I'm a big fan of their work, and I'm excited about everything down the pike. We're growing our network. We're in year 2 with the Laura Flanders Show. We're figuring out how to make our URL model exceed our expectations, and really the proof will be in the elevation of all of our partners on multiple levels. And that's what I'm really looking forward to over the next year, and I'm excited about.
Thanks so much. Well, listen, it's been a great privilege to talk to you all today. Thank you, Laura and Rory and the whole team at the Laura Flanders Show for inviting us to do this. Thank you for letting us be part of Meet the BIPOC Press. For those of you who want to have a sense of what the conversation has been like, I particularly commend the shows they've done on bomb threats at HBCUs and on Black candidates and the way that they're covered in the BIPOC press versus the mainstream press. The next episode of Meet the BIPOC Press is going to feature Ibram Kendi, and that's on the 24th of April. So I urge you all to tune into that. And thank you again, Mitra, Kalita, Sara, sorry.
Lomax-Reese, that's okay.
Sara Lomax-Reese and Laura Flanders and Lizzy Ratner, always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for taking the time. And if you like this kind of thing, and if you like the way we've used our convening power today, also, I would be remiss in not saying subscribe to The Nation, www.thenation.com. And the other links are on the chat. I wish us all a long history and continued flourishing. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, to our audience today. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.